I'm Tom Snyder, Senior Director of Schein Dental Practice Transitions. I've been involved in the dental practice transition business for over 35 years, so I've seen a lot of things going on in our profession. And of course, over the last several years, we've seen an acceleration in the DSO and group practice market. And hopefully some of you have attended our earlier programs. This is the final webinar in our 3-session series. And tonight we're going to talk about how do I maximize the value of my group. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Mr. Scot Crow and Mike White, if they could just say a word or two, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Well, Scott.
Yep. Hi, everyone. It's Scot Crow. Thanks for joining our webinar series and looking forward to talk about maximizing value today.
Hey, and good afternoon, morning, whenever you're listening to this. This is Mike White here. We are excited to continue this series of conversations this year as we look halfway through it. It's a lot of evolution and a lot of things that are impacting today. So, a great discussion.
Great. Okay. So we'll get started. Since our last program, the American Dental Association's Health Policy Institute has come up with some new data, which is somewhat significant relative to what they had been reporting in prior years. And I thought I'd just take a minute to kind of report to you what they have found. Their research has gotten a little bit more specific, so it's now looking at age groups. So it's probably not too surprising. Some of the things I'm going to tell you might already know. Now we're up to about 13% of all dentists in our profession who are affiliated with DSOs, and there's over 203,000 dentists. So you see it's a sizable number that are affiliated in some capacity with DSOs. Some very significant trends, which probably aren't too surprising, but nonetheless, here they are. 23% of dentists who are up to 10 years from graduation are affiliated with a DSO, and that number drops significantly to 11% from those doctors who are out of school from 11 to 25 years. And finally, not too surprising, about 7% of dentists who are more than 25 years out from graduation are affiliated with a DSO. And that kind of keeps up with some of the trends that we're finding is less doctors are interested in being practice owners, at least in the early stage of their career. We also find from a gender point of view that 15% of female dentists are now affiliated with DSO compared to 12% of male dentists. And the most significant trend, which has been on a decline for a number of years, that has been reported now that only 36% of dentists are considered solo practitioners compared to 46% of all dentists when the ADA reported the data just a few short years ago. But it's interesting to note that of the 36% of all dentists who've been out of school more than 25 years, 50% are still solo. So we can see how things have changed, and we can see why a lot of the DSOs now are looking at younger doctors for their affiliation. So that's all I really just wanted to share with you, basically some statistics, and let's kind of get started. Our panel. Just going to turn off my screen and we'll get started. So, first question I'm going to direct to Scott is, how active is the overall group practice DSO market today? And do you see any cooling down as we keep talking about this recession, which has been looming for quite a while?
I'll speak to that question, Tom, just from my personal perspective and our first perspective, because I don't have a complete read on the entire market, but I think our transactions and how many we're doing is a good indication. We remain busy with a number of sell-side transactions, buy-side transactions, so we see a very active market that is out there and continuing to be active, which makes sense given that the availability of capital still exists. There are some banking nuances that have changed, interest rates creep and things like that. But overall, I have not seen the market slow as today.
Mike, you have any other points?
Yeah, no, I mean, echo a little bit of what Scott said. There is still activity going. I think the deals that we are seeing are maybe taking a little longer than they used to, just as diligence is probably checking a few more, numbers along the way, dotting a few more I's, crossing T's, seeing if the market will soften a little bit on the interest rate that Scott mentioned. As we look here, and this is what I mentioned on my opening, the last 6-8 weeks, we've seen a couple major DSO lenders get out of the DSO lending business. And I think although we haven't seen the volume trickle through yet, we may see that impact here as we go into Q3, probably Q4, Q1 next year. But that's also about the same time they say there should be a softening of rate. So it may be level set. Deal volume wise, we've seen less deals, but bigger deals. So I think to Scott's point, we're all staying busy. There's a lot of work going on, a lot of activity from that standpoint. The great thing, a lot of these private equity groups and group DSOs have a lot of built up cash. The private equity groups are still trying to deploy said cash. So they're active for the right deal. And as we get into deal structure, we're seeing a little bit of nuance there, but I know we'll kind of cover that a little bit further here in a second.
Okay, great. So we did cover EBITDA, how that's defined and how it's calculated in prior programs. So I wanted to ask you, Mike, how have the continuing increases in interest rates affected the EBITDA multiples for new acquisitions?
Yeah, no, great question. So if we think, take that question into pieces. So we think about many of these deals are debt funded for a portion of the acquisition, and private equity or these groups are looking for a certain rate of return. Naturally, although interest falls below the line for pure EBITDA calculation standpoint, we realize those valuations will have to get a little bit more creative. So Scott kind of touched on it, and I know he'll bring a little bit more perspective as well. We haven't seen overall valuations decrease yet, but we are starting to see some, new ways of presenting overall valuation, how much cash at close, how much performance bonus is leveled, how much seller carryback may be done, where is that equity rolled, and how does that all look? So we're still getting to that same enterprise valuation so they can hold the values, again, as steady as possible. But we're starting to see a little bit more creativity on how that's paid from our standpoint. I don't know, Scott, if you want to chime in on anything there as well.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head that you're having to get more creative to hold those valuations. And when I say creative, buyers are less willing to take on risk that the practices won't perform post acquisition. So you're seeing clawback features, earn-out concepts, other price adjustment mechanisms to claw back potential value being paid for the practice if it doesn't only perform at the level that it is performing at today, but also a lot of these acquisitions have a growth component that is built into it, that there needs to be an actual organic growth within those practices. Otherwise, you could find yourself in a situation where you agreed to X value and 2 years later, you own less of a percentage than you thought you were going to. I don't see them going after the cash so much, but it's more the equity clawback position.
Great. Yep, I agree with that.
Okay, Scott, I'm going to ask you a little different question now. Why are some practice groups getting a higher valuation than others? If we were to compare two groups, why does one get a bigger number than the other?
A lot of different factors go into it. You have competitive bid processes, you have a whole bunch of factors that go into it. But if you're asking the very base question, if you took two practices side by side and they both went to market, the biggest factor I see is it boils down to the multiple that they're getting. So EBITDA is EBITDA. You're going to calculate it, and it's going to be whatever that number is. The multiple is more of a translation of present value of cash flow, but that's the multiple is what the market understands and what in layman's terms people understand. But what that means is, do I have a management group that is scalable? So I'll boil it down to, if you have two management groups and both are managing 10 practices, but the one management group can only manage 10, and that's it. So if you're going to add more practices, you're going to have to add more human capital versus practice two that has 10, the same number of people, 10 practices, but they're more systematized. They have a better platform. They have the ability to take on another 10 practices without any investment by the PE firm. Well, someone's going to pay more for the second than they would pay for the first, just because of the capabilities of that platform to take on and absorb more revenue without more cost. Whereas option one, you're going to have to build out that infrastructure, start to put in systems, start to spend capital. That's a more expensive proposition to a buyer, so they're willing to typically pay more for the second option than the first one. It's about your administrative team, and it doesn't mean you have to be formally structured as a DSO. It's do I have personnel on the management and admin side that can add value and continue to digest more. You can always, the DSO model is more of a legal construct than some sort of, hey, if I convert to a DSO, I'm going to get a better valuation. It's simply not the case.
I think that last part is such a critical thing, because I think the market probably started to believe that 4 or 5 years ago, where if I built a DSO, then my valuation is going up. But I think what Scott mentioned, the systemization of it, or replicability of those practices, those underlying practices, are really where we see the valuation. So if somebody can plug and play and say, okay, this group has a really good model with the right amount of capital, maybe some additional leadership positions that they don't have today, or refinement of existing leadership positions they have, we could put this practice on steroids with a lot of capital and just blow it up. So if you have 15, 20, 30 locations and they see a path forward with, man, this is so dialed in, then we can get to 40, 50, 60 locations within that, period of time that we want to hold it, without a lot of infrastructure and a lot of changes or whatnot. I think that becomes a big piece of it. I think the other side of it, and I'd be remiss without saying, is truly getting to that EBITDA number. And I think, Scott mentioned, once we can figure out what it is, I think that's the bigger point. As we look at it, and I had another one we looked at last week that was saying, hey, I want to go to market, and asked me to look at their financials, and I couldn't tell what their EBITDA was, and they couldn't tell me what it was. And they said, well, that's our problem, but we want to go to market here in the next quarter. And it's like, well, why? You're going to discount yourself. The buyer's going to see that you're not educated on your own financials, and they're going to buy you at a discount, even though they probably know what your EBITDA actually is. So we always talk about telling your story, making sure your financials are up to date, making sure there's a process. And if you're not going to go through a full financial statement cleanup, then do a sell-side quality of earnings report, or in some modeling and budgeting, and truly understand where those numbers are coming from to help yourself out, and to help yourself out in the negotiation process.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned there, Mike, is knowing your business. The worst thing you want is a buyer to come in and have a better grasp of your business than you do during a sales process. It will show a sign of weakness.
As we look at that, Tom, on the, necessarily, if you don't have a DSO or even a management company, but you do have a central billing manager or a bookkeeper on staff or IT, that doesn't mean go build a DSO just so you can move those expenses, but be able to identify if it's a drag on practice location 1 and 4, because you have additional corporate overhead running through those. Make sure you're able to peel that overhead cost out, because they may or may not want it. They may have a billing person already. They may want to build on your team already. They may not need your corporate space. Those are all add back discussions and adjustment opportunities for you as you build that. So when we look at this, it's like, hey, we don't necessarily need a DSO, maybe a management company, but more importantly, we need to understand what the practice level, EBITDA is, the contribution margin from each practice, in addition to what your corporate overhead is, so we can truly tell that story, because everybody's benchmarking everything. And the great thing is, you go back to those early stats that you had, Tom, the market is evolving, and the education and the insights and in the, benchmarking data is becoming more and more prevalent, to where people can utilize that even as they come in as lay people outside of this industry.
Great. So what can our audience do to improve their prospects of a higher valuation? Mike, I'll let you take a shot at this first.
I start with, I'm going to build off what I just mentioned. I think the biggest thing is making sure your financials are current and relevant, understanding profitability by practice, understanding the tie out between your practice management data and your financial statements, being able to know what your EBITDA is and any personal expenses you run through that could possibly be add backs. We always say, do an analysis, do an assessment, talk to somebody like Scott, talk to somebody like myself, have them look at your contracts, Have them look at your agreements. Are they in compliance? Do we have any issues or red flags if we were to go to market that somebody else would discount that issue and want to bring that to your attention? From a financials, what's your story? What do you anticipate? Not only what you did the last 12 months and last 3 years, but what do you expect to do over the next 12 months to 3 years? Did you add another associate, 3 more hygienists? Did you add 4 more locations? You know, what's been going on with your business, and what's the prospect forward? If somebody is to come partner with you, what does life look like together afterwards? And be able to tell that story and correlate it back to your financials.
Scott, anything to add there? Chance?
Well, I think Mike is, I can add a little bit, but I think Mike is dead on point. If you're going to go to market, do financial diligence around your company and do legal diligence around your company. Understand where your gaps and your blind spots are before you go into a transaction. It can help you get organized from a diligence standpoint, because there is going to be a lot of diligence, a long checklist of items, both legal and financial, that the buyer is going to want. The faster you deliver those and more organized you are, the faster the transaction will go and smoother it will go for you, because the buyer's not waiting. You give the impression of organizational skills, credibility goes up. Longer they wait and have to ask and beg for items, those become problematic. So engaging your counsel and your accountant, 6 to 9 months in advance of, prior to going into a sale transaction. While many don't do it, it's your best bet, because you can come in on a very private process, get your records, get your books, get things cleaned up, and understand the changes you've made in your business that are going to impact it positively or negatively. So when you're asked these questions during the sales process, you're able to answer and address them, or they're non-issues at all because they've been addressed.
And I would say, Tom, I think from a preparedness standpoint, Scott touched on it. This becomes a second job for many. I think a lot of people go into this process thinking, great, I'll just send over my P&L, my balance sheet, my QuickBooks file, and my partnership docs, and that's it. And this becomes, and the word deal fatigue is real. Yeah. The longer that deal, drags out, the less confidence they have in your ability to produce accurate data, your ability to understand your business, and ability to kind of move the ball forward and move at the speed they want to move at. So being ready, market ready, mentally, and of course have as many of your documents together as possible, but being ready to go through this process, work evenings, work mornings, gather that information, and stay on a 24 or 48-hour turn of request becomes very important and vital to your reputation, to what you're trying to present to the market.
Well, in particularly, if you have a clawback concept that you agree to in your agreement, deal fatigue will take your attention off of your revenue generation, your profitability, which those things come into play post-closing and hurt you. So the less organized you are, it puts your purchase price that you expect to receive at risk if you're not prepared going into it. And Mike is what, you can't do it, I'm going to do it Wednesday night from 4 to 6. That's not going to work. Like, you need to go in this as a full-time position, because it is. If you want to get it done correctly, you want to maximize value, you got to dedicate the time to it.
Makes a lot of sense. So Scott, what are most buyers really looking for in these acquisitions?
It depends on the type of buyer you're talking about. Strategic versus a private equity. Strategic being an existing platform that's simply trying to add revenue via what are commonly called bolt-ons or single practice acquisitions. Bolt-ons being a group of locations that are added on. It's different for different PE buyers, but in the general sense, they're looking, which is why you have the financial diligence piece on the front side of it, is repeatability and consistency of the revenue that they are acquiring, making sure that in fact is there. And then outside of that, you get into culture. Are the people and the teams a good fit? Do they fit within your geographic location? Like, it depends on the buyer what exactly they're looking for. But in general, they're all looking for revenue that's repeatable and consistent and without a ton of legal issues. Typically in a sales process or buy-side process, once the LOI gets penned, the first thing that is addressed is financial diligence. So the buyer and the seller can come back and look at the numbers and either agree on the price or agree on a price adjustment. typically downwards if there is one, but there are instances where price can go up. Not all the time, but it does on a rare occasion happen. And then from there, if once price is agreed to, you get into legal diligence and you're really looking for material issues in the transaction. And there are ways to protect both parties through the legal process with reps and warranties insurance, which is a simple way of saying if there's a problem with the purchase agreement, there's a claim made against the company, there is insurance that protects both parties from any failed disclosures or misstatements made in the purchase.
You think, Arthur?
I mean, Scott touched on a lot of things. I mean, my first thought was the strategic versus private equity and what they're respectively looking for. And, Scott really covered a lot of those points. I mean, I think the big thing I would add to it is, we get a lot of conversations. I know, Tom, you do too. Scott, you do too. Well, I'm a Medicaid practice, or I'm in Central Ohio, or I'm in, backwoods Louisiana, whatever it may be. Is there going to be a buyer for me? And I think every one of those discussions or caveats or how you run your practice or what kind of practice you have, there's not one size fits all. I know, I go to a lot of conferences. I think we all do on this call. People hear, oh, I need to switch my entire business model over to PPO because that's what everybody wants. And, that's not necessarily. You're going to eliminate some prospective partners and buyers along the way, but that doesn't mean you've eliminated everybody. So there is a right partner for everybody, I would say, but for most people and what you're looking to accomplish, what they are. And if they're not there today, they may be there tomorrow. But that's the exciting thing is we constantly get to meet new people that are coming into this industry that were in ophthalmology or veterinary or physician before that are like, hey, let's take a look at this dental thing. Or they were outside of the United States and they're now coming into the United States saying, hey, I did this in Canada, I did this in Switzerland, now I want to do it in the US as well. So there's always somebody to partner with. So make sure you've dialed in your model, learn and grow and absorb from everybody you get to talk to, but know that, I would say 9 times out of 10, there's a buyer for everybody, right? We'll always caveat something, but we can't have a lawyer on the phone without caveating something.
Absolutely true.
This is a general question because I know that some of the folks out there are wondering, there's practices of different size, maybe 2 offices, 3, 15, 20 or more. To give our audience an idea of the magnitude of transaction costs that they may incur, they could expect a tremendous return without putting anybody on the spot, but giving our audience a range of, when you're going to look for professional help, this is an investment one has to make to get it done right and not worry about the costs, especially with the return that these folks can eventually get, depending, of course, on the size. So I'm wondering if you might want to just give us some general ideas without, giving an absolute as much as just an idea to the audience.
I get the question a lot, and I'm sure, Scott will have some say as well. I get the question a lot, and I'm going to say it depends. We've seen practices that are very well put together, ready to go, but they want to run a process. So there's investment banking fees, which could be 3 to 6, 3 to 7% of the deal value, not just cash at close, but the deal value. There's going to be legal costs. There's going to be professional costs like myself. And then of course there's closing costs on, as part of the transaction as well. It could be significant, when I say significant, 6 figures, depending on deal size, 7 figures we've seen. But at the same time, what you have to look at personally, professionally is what does this mean? What is that ROI? And you kind of touched on it, Tom. What's that ROI to me for this business? When we look at historically valuations for a solo dental practice, trade to trade or doctor to doctor, 62 to 82% of trailing 12 collections, or 2.5 to 3 times multiple of EBITDA. Today, that same practice is 6 times, 7 times EBITDA. So you start looking at this like, okay, I am going to have more deal costs because more, people are involved. However, I also know my valuation in today's marketplace is a little bit higher as well. So I'd say, when you get into this, interview your potential professionals, make sure they've been through this process, make sure they understand your specific situation. Because I've seen more often than not, people try to get a friend involved and it costs them more on valuation, or try to get somebody who's a little cheaper hourly rate, but there's 3 times more hours. So you kind of really have to understand who your professionals are and your partners are, because it could make a significant difference in what you pocket in your cash.
It makes a lot of sense. Scott?
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit on what Mike was kind of talking about, which is from a fee perspective, you touched on the lower hourly rate, my friend, and I've done a ton of buy-side transactions. And I always, although it was nice to be on the winning side of a purchase agreement, in some cases you almost felt bad because they were represented by lawyers that were not focused on the right issues, missed the big picture, missed risk allocation, a number of factors going into it that had they been involved in these transactions, those would have been topics of discussion and you would have landed in a better position for a seller. So on the sell side, my biggest advice to you is cheap does not mean better. It often means you're exposing yourself to more risk than you should be taking on in the transaction. And hopefully, if things work out and you have a clean business, there's no issue. But it's not a gamble I would take if I was in a selling position for counsel that we're not talking astronomical price difference, but it is higher to get representation that's qualified and skilled and capable in the area of what you're walking into. And DSO transactions are complex, but it's not the regulatory side that's complex. So hiring a regulatory lawyer to do a sales transaction is not in your best interest because the regulatory piece has been figured out. It's been looked at by 10 different law firms over the several years that the platform's been in existence, and your assumption is they have a legally, compliant structure. But I guess my closing remark is it's not going to be cheap to sell your practice. Even a single location, it's not going to be $20K. It's going to be more in the $50 to $75K range to do it correctly. And that's going to be dependent on your participation, how often your counsel has to reach out to you to ask for questions. So this is where doing some pre-planning and getting yourself organized can help you reduce your fees of both your advisors and all the people that are on your team, because you're organized. It'll be easier for them to get organized and less costly overall.
That makes a lot of sense. I just wanted to raise that because I think I want our audience to realize, this is big business now, and you really need to surround yourself with experts. And I want to thank you both again for, your involvement and commitment to this three-part series. And I hope that those of you who attended have really listened closely to Mike and Scott and taken to heart some of the things they've been telling you. It is, the amount of money that most dentists can make now it's unbelievable. Never in my my career, which has been a long one, we never saw this kind of, wealth creation that we're seeing now in the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a wonderful thing, but to get to that point, you've got to put all the right pieces together and not be afraid to open up your checkbook, because it's only going to mean your bottom line is going to look better. And that's kind of how I look at it in a simplistic sort of way, watching things change over the years. So unless you gentlemen have any other parting comments, I want to thank you both. I've enjoyed working with you. You really understand the market and have the expertise and the background and the years to see what's going on. And we're still in the early stages of this. We're not in the end game. There's a lot of practices out there that are, wondering, is it going to be me or my group tomorrow? And I'd say probably yes. Somebody will be knocking on your door at some point.
There's a new startup practice every day. So as you guys know, so that's the fun part.
Yep, for sure. Without a doubt. Well, I wanted to thank you all again. In closing, this is just our information, our website, henryscheindpt.com. And you can also email at dpt@henryschein.com. And of course, call our toll-free number at 800-988-5674. So again, I thank you both for your expertise and time commitment to this series. And I hope all the folks that are watching this We'll maybe watch it 2 or 3 times again so it sinks in. This is a great opportunity for all, and I wish you all well and have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Great team.
Bye.